Reading Jesus' advice about sitting in the wrong seats reminds me of a trip that Mary and I took to Boston in 2005. Clemson University, where I served, was playing Boston College in a football game that weekend, so Mary and I took a group of about 20 of our students up to Boston for the game. As game time approached, we made our way into the stadium and looked for our seats. Bobby, who was a good friend of ours, who was also the director of athletic ticketing at Clemson, had arranged for our tickets, and we were pleased to find that he had gotten us seats down in Section W, in the lower level, about 16 rows off the field. With seats so close to the field, I began to think that our friend in high places had really taken care of us. Maybe we were a little more important than I had thought. Not just anybody can make a call to a friend in the athletic department to score seats like these. I reminded myself to thank Bobby when we got home. But then an older gentleman and his wife arrived and informed us that some of our group was sitting in his seats. We looked at our tickets, and they were very clearly labeled Section W. Thinking this poor old man had gotten confused, I replied, "No, sir, our tickets are for this section in these rows." I showed him our tickets and explained that they were given to us by a very important official at Clemson University. There must be some mistake. I began to realize, however, that the mistake was mine when he informed me that he and his wife had been sitting in those particular seats for 20 years. We called an usher over who examined our tickets and agreed that clearly we both had tickets for the same section in the same row, Section W. But then Mary, ever the bright and clear-thinking type, asked a very astute question. "Does this stadium have a Section VV?" Turns out, yes, it did. And that section was in the upper deck, considerably further away from the field than we were. The old dot matrix printer used by the Boston College ticket office had printed two V's that looked remarkably similar to one W. We offered our apologies and moved to our correct seats. Incidentally, I will tell you that the 16th row of Section VV is actually the last row of the upper deck. We still thanked Bobby for our tickets when we got home, but just a little less enthusiasm than originally. Adding to the embarrassment of reading our tickets incorrectly and then carefully explaining to a seasoned ticket holder that he was wrong was the realization that we were not quite as important as I had thought, which is just the kind of situation that Jesus warns us about in this passage today. Rather than exalt yourself, he says, by taking the best seat in the house, you should humble yourself by sitting in the back. The situation was a large banquet, which in Jesus' day would have been held in a large room with couches arranged such that the host would be seated at the front of the room and the guests would be seated around him, with the most important guests seated closest to the host. To be seated next to the host was the highest honor. James and John, you will remember, asked Jesus to be seated at his right hand and on his left in the kingdom. And when at his trial before the council, Jesus is asked whether he is the Messiah, he replies, "From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God." So it was not unusual for important guests at a banquet to expect the choice seats up front, close to the host. Status and importance is measured by where you sit even still today. Luxury boxes on game day, box seats at the theater, first-class seats on your flight, and a seat in the back of a chauffeur-driven limo on the way to the airport. Now, Jesus is not offering a way to get yourself exalted by being humble. His point is that it is best to be humble and to avoid seeing ourselves as more important than we are, to recognize that our value comes not from how others see us or worldly marks of status, but from just being children of God, which is not a new concept. Proverbs, the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, says that pride goes before destruction. And in Matthew, Jesus says that whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, why is it so important to be humble and so bad to be prideful? Because we are told over and over that the greatest law is to love God and to love each other. But pride is the opposite of that. Pride is loving ourselves more than anything else. So Jesus encourages the guests to shun the honor seat. Humble yourself. If you're invited to the front, great. But if not, the food is going to taste just the same in the back. But Jesus also understands that who gets on the guest list is often a function of how they can benefit the host. Jesus says when you throw a party, don't invite your friends or relatives or your rich neighbors, the folks who can pay you back, the folks for whom an invitation from you might be a way to guarantee their favor in the future. No, invite the weak and the poor and those who have need but no way to reward you for your invitation. And that's a very challenging passage, taken literally. Don't invite friends and relatives. Mom's not going to be happy come Christmas. But is that what Jesus is saying here? Is this an injunction against inviting friends and family to your home for dinner or to celebrate important occasions? Must we host groups of the homeless and the poor and the lame every time we celebrate a graduation or a birthday or an anniversary? No, that's not what Jesus is saying. You can still have the family over for the holidays this year. For some of you, that's good news. For some of you, maybe not. But Jesus is pointing out that the Pharisee has only invited people to his home who can benefit him. For the Pharisee, people have value only insofar as they can do something for him. If knowing them or inviting them into his home does not provide him with some benefit, then he does not bother. On the surface, we could say that this passage is more like an etiquette lesson. But the heart of Jesus' message here is about the value that we place on other people, that we should not place a higher value on ourselves than we do on others, that we should not place greater value on people who are easy to love or from whom we can gain a benefit or advantage than we place on those who have nothing to offer us. Because when we do, we begin to orient our lives toward loving and serving only those who can love and serve us back. And if we love and serve only those who will give us something in return, we've really only loved and served ourselves. So yes, this story does offer some advice about where to sit in a party. And in these admonitions, we do find important lessons about humility and hospitality. But on a deeper level, it is a reminder that all people have great value, whether we recognize it or not. We can see the difference in how people value lives in the very beginning of this passage when Jesus heals a man with dropsy and does so on the Sabbath. Now, dropsy is an old term for the swelling of soft tissue due to the accumulation of excess water. In modern language, it's more frequently referred to as edema and is really more of a symptom than a disease in itself. In healing the man's condition, Jesus once again runs afoul of the Pharisees for his refusal to observe the prohibitions against working on the Sabbath. Jesus heals this man and asks a poignant and telling question of those who would judge him. If it was your child, wouldn't you break the law to help? If it was your ox by which you plow the fields and perform work and are able to prosper and support your family, wouldn't you break the law to rescue it? Jesus seems to understand that this nameless man who is defined only by his illness and his need is not his son, but he is most certainly someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. But perhaps most importantly, he is one of God's beautiful creations. He is a child of God and is therefore just as important as anyone else. This man is worth breaking the Sabbath law for. You see, Jesus affirmed the value in all people, not because of what they were capable of, and not because of what they could do for him, but simply because they were children of God, period. And by placing this little healing story before his account of the banquet and the warnings about taking the front seats and inviting the right guests, Luke's Jesus challenges what the Pharisees believe about the value of people. Which is good news for you and me, because it reminds us that God loves and cherishes us in spite of our weaknesses and in spite of our failings and in spite of the wounds and hurts and marks that we've picked up over the years. It means that we are worthy of God's love and one another's love simply because we are. And that is good news. but it's also a challenge to you and to me, because it reminds us that the people around us, the ones very much like us and the ones that appear so very different, the ones we like and the ones that are hard to love, they are all valuable to God too. And so we must seek to find ways to love them and to value them just as God does. I used to know a man named Kenny who was not technically homeless because he had a place to stay at night, but it wasn't really the kind of home that most of us would feel comfortable in. Kenny walked the streets of Clemson, South Carolina on most days, looking for a little work, trying to stay out of trouble with the police, which was hard for him, but then life was hard for Kenny. People would usually give Kenny some money or food, but what he really craved was companionship. He loved to talk, and while people were often quick to provide for his physical need, they would rarely stop to engage him in conversation. Sometimes I did, but sometimes I did not. Sometimes I didn't have the time to talk to Kenny, or couldn't make time, or wouldn't. Sometimes I just had more important things to do. But as I think back, I wonder if I could have so easily dismissed him had he been my child, my brother, my father. As children of God, we all have value, but in our culture, we tend to base the value of people on how pretty and undamaged they appear. Weakness and brokenness are feared and avoided at all costs. I was thinking about that while looking through my son's books the other day. You see, my little boys love books. Mike Mulligan and his Steam Shovel, Llama Llama Red Pajama, Goodnight Moon, Bubble Trouble. They love them. Some get read over and over to the point that Mary and I could recite them from memory. Those books get read and reread until the pages are smudged by little fingers sticky from ice cream and juice. The pages are turned over and over until they get ripped and torn. Pop-up books no longer pop up. Scratch and sniff books are now just scratch books. On the nights when I sit with Will Gray in his room and read with him, the books that he enjoys most are often the ones most marred by dirt and most often torn and mended with Scotch tape. Yet no matter how badly the wrinkled the pages get, no matter how many words are obscured by little finger smudges, no matter how bent the covers or broken the hinges, Will Gray loves them all just the same. I think we are a little like those books on the shelf. We bear the marks of years of wear and tear, of small victories and emotional defeats, scars you can see, some you can't. By our outward appearances, we may seem to be worn out or broken and not worth the time it would take to open our pages and find the beauty within. We get wrinkled and torn. Some of us are held together with lots and lots of Scotch tape. We're hard to read sometimes, and not as pretty and perfect as when we were brand new. But we all have a story to tell. We all have value. Not because of what we can offer, but simply because we were created and loved by God. For you and I, this is an invitation to see the value in everyone, and a challenge to find ways to be involved with our brothers and sisters who seem most different from us, maybe even a little scary. It's challenging and it's difficult, and it may even be counter to good sense sometimes. It's not a license to take risks, but it is a reminder to not let risky circumstances deter us from loving one another, or deter us from loving one another, not for what we can get out of it, but simply because we are all children of God. And that makes each one of us valuable beyond measure. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come.